Good? We're live. So good evening, everybody, here in Berlin, in Factory Görlitzer Park, in the beautiful cinema, and out there in YouTube land. Welcome. Thanks for joining us on this beautiful evening for this speaker event and panel discussion. My name is Rob Gierk. I'm one of the captains of the Sustainability Circle here in Factory Berlin. And the Factory Berlin Sustainability Circle is a community of sustainability-driven entrepreneurs, artists, writers, change makers. And together we're working on projects, exchange our experiences, we learn from one another and support each other on our journeys. We're frequently and regularly organizing such events like today. And different kinds and various themes in the wide spectrum of sustainability. We recently joined up with the Global Goals Jam Berlin. Global Goals Jam is an international series of hackathon which all will happen simultaneously in September and working in respect to the sustainable development goals and calling ourselves Sustainability Circle. We of course support that cause in this event. With that being said, we are extremely happy to have today one of the organizers in the audience or with us today. His name is Nadim Choucair, and I would like to ask Nadim on stage right now to say a couple things about the Global Goals Jam. Please give it up for Nadim.
Thanks so much, Rob. I'm really pleased to be here back in Factory after this sort of pandemic. It's really cool to see that events are starting to pick up again. I am a member of this circle, very active circle, so thanks for the support for the jam. So very quickly here to say a couple of words about the jam, and Roman, if you could switch to the next slide, if that's possible, so that everybody can see it, or no, from here. Thank you.
My name is Frank Ackermann. I'm the founder of STG Investment. We make the SDGs investable. In order to really get it moving, we need the big money. And that is where we are positioned, in the middle between projects and institutional investors. We at SDG, in combination with all these people and events, especially the Global Goals Jam organized by 2030 Cabinet, I think we all have the goal to design 2030.
The Global Goals Jam is a 2-day design sprint. This means participants from various backgrounds meet and form multidisciplinary teams. They then work together to design solutions for local challenges related to the SDGs.
It's an opportunity to collaborate with like-minded people interested in sustainability. Throughout the Jam, we focus on peer-to-peer education and on teams co-creating ideas for the SDGs.
It's been as you saw in this video, the Jam is really an event that happens globally in 90 cities across the world, usually in September before Global Goals Week and the UN General Assembly. It's coordinated and globally coordinated and initiated by the Digital Society School in Amsterdam. I am the local coordinator here in Berlin with my agency 2030 Cabinet, accelerating progress towards the goals through partnerships. Next event is happening this September actually. So it's on September 18th to 20th, and pre-registration is now open, so you can just head to globalgoalsberlin.com and you can pre-register your interest and you'll be informed when the tickets are out, because we're still monitoring the situation whether this will be an online or face-to-face event, and then we'll be able to let you know. So yeah, go ahead, pre-register and come solve challenges with us related to the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much, Nadim. So you heard it. Oh, kicking my timer over here. Please give it up for Nadim Choucair. Okay, so we partnered up with the Global Goals Jam, and we're getting ready. We're warming up for this big event, and we're calling this the Road to the Global Goals Jam. So we're organizing theme weeks around the biggest challenges which we are facing, and we're kicking off now in July with energy, one of the biggest challenges which we are having as humanity today. Solutions for saving and generating energy in a sustainable way is absolutely crucial for solving the global climate crisis, to foster dignified life on planet Earth, and to positively evolve as a global society. We have 4 very interesting speakers with us today, and they all come from different angles of the energy subject. That makes it so diverse and so interesting this evening today. And thank you for joining us on this evening to learn about solutions to save and sustainably generate energy and to discuss these with us. We'll have a panel discussion following the talks and a Q&A with the audience following the panel discussion. Those of you who are here on site, we have a microphone set up for you, so you can ask your questions then live here to the panelists. And for you out there on YouTube, you can just simply put your questions in the chat, on the commenting right next to the picture frame, and we will try to answer these questions as well. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. His name is Philipp Singer, and Philipp is the co-founder and managing director of Leaders for Climate Action. Leaders for Climate Action is a non-profit and a community of entrepreneurs who, united by the will to counter the climate crisis with their own actions, demand more effective legislation from policymakers. They aim to transform the digital industry to climate neutrality and inspire other industry to follow them. With this organization, Philipp is building a community of climate-aware leaders, helping them to turn their companies to carbon neutral and enabling them to drive even more powerful actions in every segment of our ecosystem. Philipp holds a degree in mechanical engineering from Technical University Berlin, and before Leaders for Climate Action, he was the co-founder of the mobile commerce startup Joydy. After selling the company, Philipp is now fully focusing on countering the climate crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Philipp Singer.
And can I have the... Okay, no worries. Yeah, thank you very much for having me today. I'm, as already introduced, Philipp, and I would love to talk about Leaders for Climate Action today. And actually, I can start where this journey started for me, because it was exactly here in the factory 1.5 years ago when I left my company. And I wanted to commit the next time of my life into fighting the climate crisis. And when I started this, it was not at all clear what it will be. And I'm extremely happy that since 1 year, I'm working on this project and really put everything in there with my team. So let me see. So as I discussed already shortly, we started Leaders for Climate Action about a year ago. And at this time, it was really an impulse that we looked at the digital ecosystem, at the startup ecosystem, and we were simply disappointed that in regards of fighting the climate crisis, in many companies there was so much talking going on, but so little action. And we strongly believe that our ecosystem and us as a digital industry, we have a really unique role in this fight against the climate crisis, and therefore also a very unique responsibility. Because what makes us really special is we are so fast in transforming something from A to B, and our solutions are needed to make this turnaround happening. And the wrong thing that comes out of these thoughts would be to say the other industries are bad, so we can be slow as well. And we actually believe that us as the digital ecosystem, we need to be the first ones that more or less turn climate neutral or even climate positive, and therefore really putting pressure on the one hand side, on the one hand side on politics, in order to, make stronger legislation, and on the other side, on the industry. And therefore, we really need to be quick on making it happen, first of all, with us. And the approach that we have as Leaders for Climate Action is that there needs to be a neutral organization that is not commercially driven, but that simply accelerates the speed of the transformation in the digital industry. And that's what we are as Leaders for Climate Action. And the way how we do it is, we go to the most important tech companies in Europe, the most important venture capital companies in Europe, and the most important green tech companies in Europe. And first of all, we win over the decision makers. And that is why also we have this name of Leaders for Climate Action, because we believe if we win the people who can make the decision, all the changes will be carried out much faster. So everything starts with a personal commitment. So every leader who comes on our platform has to make a green pledge. So every person has to first of all measure the carbon footprint of the last year. Everyone has to commit personally on actually reducing the carbon footprint, because that is clearly the most important thing that we have to do. But on top, we also say, besides reducing, everyone needs to offset also 100% of the carbon footprint. And after this is done, we move to the company. So one person inside of the company becomes what we call a climate officer. And this is for our big supporters like Flixbus or Delivery Hero, normally the head of sustainability. For our very small companies, it can be really everyone from a personal assistant to a head of marketing. And these people then have the task within the first 3 months to understand the carbon footprint of the company, put in measures to reduce, and also invest money into climate projects in terms of offsetting. And that is basically what all of our now 500 companies commit to in the first month to do. And what is just important, that's why I have a whole slide for it, reduction is the most important thing, and we integrated programs that is simply focusing on this reduction part. And I mean, probably a lot of you are very familiar with this topic of measuring your carbon footprint. And I do believe for a digital company to be carbon neutral, it's simply not enough, because it's something that you can do in a very quick way. So the big goal of our organization is that we tap into the impact fields that we see, and that can be very different from the companies that are on board. So if we are, for example, talking about a finance company, a typical venture capital company, the leverage in our eyes is if we can motivate people to, on the one hand side, invest more in green technologies, and on the other side, push companies that are maybe not a green technology to at least also measure, reduce, and offset the carbon. And this is just one example in the finance sector. It can also be using the end customer reach. So a company with maybe only 10 employees can have 2 million monthly active users, so that the leverage can be there. So that is basically what's happening after the normal onboarding, that we look together what we can do. And one example of this is a venture capital clause that we were able to implement with the top 35 venture capital companies from Germany, but also from the northern part of Europe, where we now created this clause in every term sheet and in every shareholder agreement that these companies give out. So actually the startups, they have to start report carbon to the board. They have to show that they're actively trying to reduce carbon while growing, and if possible also put budget aside. And that's for me like a typical example of where we can generate more impact. And we started in Germany in the beginning, but for the last 3 months, we are rolling this out in Europe. And have now leaders from everywhere here. And we have a lot of like big companies on board, but we also, and that's maybe more important here, we are also looking into how can we help innovation to happen? How can we find green tech companies, get them the best talent, and get them money in order to really make the big changes happening? And towards the end of the year, our goal is that we really become this voice for Europe that asks politics to do more, because I think that is something that we as a tech community always underestimate, that people are not listening to us. But we noticed that actually the politicians that want to fight for a good change, they need voices from the industry, from the companies that say, we want more and we are delivering already. And that is basically where we think is another leverage inside of the politics. Thank you.
Please give it up for Philipp Singer. What a concept. Making the leaders of the tech companies responsible, having them make their pledge, measuring, tracking. This is how we drive the transformation. Correct. Thank you so much, Philipp. Really appreciate it. Now we come to our second speaker. His name is Gerke Gersema. He's the Vice President of Operations at Thermondo. Thermondo is a 7-year-old scale-up installing different efficient heating systems in residential houses. He's responsible for everything that happens after a heating installation is sold and until it's fully installed and in operation. Gerke joined Thermondo a little more than a year ago, and overall he worked a total of 10 years on everything related to the energy transition. Before joining Thermondo, Gerke was a project manager at McKinsey, where he worked exclusively in the energy sector. He has a PhD in energy economics from TU Munich, where he wrote his dissertation on risk management for renewable energy. He's been living in Berlin for about 10 years, and he is a proud father of a 2.5-year-old son. So please give it up for Gerke Gersema.
Thanks for having me. So I would like to talk about my current passion today, which is Thermondo on the one hand, the company I try to help build, and secondly about the sleeping giant. There's a saying I think that works a bit better in German, that the heating transition is the sleeping giant of the energy transition. And let me show you first why I think that is the case. So on this chart you'll see the renewable share in energy generation that we have increased from 2010 or over the last decade, you can say, right? And if you look at the light blue colors, that's the renewable share in power. And it has continuously increased and it's looking really, really well. And then in the dark blue, you actually see the renewable share in heat. So our warm water, our warm houses in the winter, and quite frankly, we don't even really see, you have to look quite closely to see a positive trend, at least in the renewables share. And maybe from my personal experience, I kind of spent the last 10 years really focusing on the light blue part. So I worked a lot for renewable energy projects, how to make offshore wind farms more efficient, how to build utility scale solar projects, how to sell solar systems to residential homeowners, etc. And the clear path, the path forward is really, really clear. I mean, it's a continuous increase now of solar and wind power. At least the path to 80% renewable share is very, very clear. After that, it gets a bit difficult, but I'm sure we can manage. For heat, it really isn't that clear yet. So that is what I decided to focus the next phase of my life on, and joined Thermondo. But to take one step back, okay, generally what I think is a core part of the energy transition, of course, is decentralization, right? So we come from a system where we have a couple of 100 large power plants that pretty much support or run the entire system. And in the future, it's not going to be a couple of 100 of big plants anymore, it's going to be millions of homeowners. And that also means that we have to change millions of homes. So imagine a residential house today, 1, 2 families. It typically has one piece of energy technology, which is the boiler, the heating system. And fast forward 20 years, if we want to be successful with the energy transition, it is inevitable that that house has to look completely different. So probably still need the heating system, for sure, but it also needs a solar panel and probably has an e-vehicle outside. It has a wall box for that. It likely has a battery storage. The heating system has to look entirely different. Maybe that's the heat pump, might be, quite likely. And then all of these all of that equipment also has to be automated or call it smart. And it's a massive undertaking to change all of these houses. I mean, in Germany we have 15 million one and two family homes, right? And just a lot of physical change that has to happen. And that's the idea of Termondo. So we want to be that company that helps the homeowner go that transition. And we want to make it really, really easy for the homeowner to go on that transition. It should be frictionless, it should actually be inevitable to do it, to change your house over the coming 10 years. And that's what we set out to do. And we actually started with the heating system itself, or with the heating segment itself, because first of all, that is, as I said, it's the sleeping giant, but it's also the one piece of equipment that's already in every house. So, and it's more than 80% of household energy consumption, if you don't include mobility, is in heat at the moment. Secondly, it's also a large opportunity because we have to run a business, and to scale and to be meaningful, we obviously needed to tackle a market that is already big. And then lastly, at the moment we have 50,000 small installation companies with an average number of employees of 7 to 8. So I told you before, right? I think it has to be frictionless for the customer to go that transition. Like they have to, they need someone who takes care of them on the path to change their house. There's some great companies among these 50,000, but many of them are not innovative. Actually, what many customers tell us is you can be lucky if they call you back or if they make you an offer. So we really wanted to change that and be different. And for that, Termondo spent the last 7 years in building a machine, I would say, of to provide that customer journey. So, and it has two parts pretty much. So, or two unique characteristics, I would say. First of all, we had to realize that you have to be fully vertically integrated to actually provide a great customer journey. So we do everything from lead generation. We have an outside sales force that is at the customer's house and helps them make the right decision. We have a German-wide craftsman organization. So we actually have own craftsmen, they're employed, they get social security, everything. We have our own vans. And an after-sales organization. That's the one part. And it's very, very complex to manage that. There's a good reason that there are 50,000 craftsman companies at the moment, because it is a very, very complicated, and each heating project is actually, unfortunately, is unique. So standardization is very, very hard. And secondly, we have a large suite of our own software that we had to build to run that Germany-wide installation organization, and that includes a website, of course. It includes an algorithm that asks the customer tons of questions and then provides them with the best solution. For instance, the best efficient heating system that includes all the subsidies, that gives him a fixed price offer right away, so he can immediately decide to take that offer. And also shows him how much energy he can save and how much emissions he can save, right? Because so he can make a conscious decision for what heating system he actually wants to have. And then there's a platform we call Diego, with which you organize tons of processes around the installation, and there's an app that the craftsmen actually have in their hand. So for them also, a core part of this entire transition is to actually have people go to those houses and physically work to change the houses. Those are the craftsmen, and we don't really have enough of those, and also we don't leverage them enough. So what we really try to do is to take all the unnecessary work away from them. So they work entirely paperless. They get to an installation site that is very, very well prepared. They can do all the documentation on their tablet. They get help if they need to, and they're fully responsible also. They're very, very proud craftsmen, because they're very proud on what they actually accomplish, right? Because they can really focus on what they're good at. And lastly, we also have our end customer app, in which the customer can then see what his consumption is, and can also manage his heating system efficiently. Yeah, so that is the machine we have built over the last 7 years. We're scaling quite fast now, and kind of everything works together now, but it's a very, very long transition. I think we have a long way ahead of us because we're still, even after 7 years, only in heat. And I told you there are a lot of other components in the house that have to follow. And we're also really not yet, we want to become even better in the kind of heating systems that we install, of course. So there's still a long path ahead for us. Last remark, but I won't go into detail here, is that because we talk a lot about the role of politics as well, right? And just 7 months ago, the German government really entirely changed the subsidy scheme for heating systems in Germany. And so in the past, also gas and oil boilers, while they were efficient, they were subsidized. And now it is only possible to get subsidies for a partially renewable heating system. And I can just say that it's incredible how fast that actually changes the entire dynamics. So it entirely, I mean, we are well prepared for that because we know how to deal with subsidies, because we know how to calculate the optimal heating system, but it entirely changes customer demand and really unlocks something. So that's, I think, a good combination of regulatory action and then us as a startup using it. So that's also why we can scale so fast at the moment. So thanks.
Please give a big round of applause for Gerke. You can drop this over here. Thank you so much. What a concept. I mean, really hands-on managing the transition in the residential housing sector, making it a frictionless experience and with a long roadmap ahead, actually, still. So it's amazing. Thank you so much, Gerke, for this presentation, for this talk. Which brings me to our next speaker, to our third speaker, who is Ella van der Put. And she is working as a project engineer for the company Enapter. Enapter is a company producing electrolyzers. Those are devices which split water into oxygen and hydrogen. And Enapter wants to disrupt the energy sector with small-scale electrolyzers as a commodity. Ella spoke at the 24 Hours of Climate Reality event and at the Big Thing, a hydrogen conference in Thailand last year. She studied international technical cooperation with a focus on energy engineering. Ella, before Enapter, worked also for a solar company, and she participated in a Brazilian youth exchange project. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Ella van der Put.
Thank you, Rob. Different from the two speakers before me, I'm not concentrating so much on what the company I'm working for does, but more on the greater topic of hydrogen. So the energy transition, the future of energy needs decarbonization. But how are we going to achieve that? If you look at the public discourse in Germany on the Energiewende, it mainly focuses on how are we going to build up more windmills? How are we going to install more solar panels? So basically, how will we get more electricity from renewable sources? While this is a good start, it is by no means enough for two main reasons. One is energy storage. So what are you going to do if the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing? You somehow need to store energy for winter, but also for emergencies, especially for critical infrastructure like hospitals. So one way to do that is batteries. They're very fine for short-term storage and like small to medium amounts of energy. But if you want to store like solar electricity from summer to winter, this will give you problems because batteries self-discharge over time. And also, if you want to store huge amounts of energy, the batteries actually are quite expensive and they take up a lot of space. So what we are looking for is something like oil or gas, which we can store indefinitely without it's losing its energy content. That is because it's a molecule, it's matter that we can put into a container and then we're not losing anything of it. But at the same time, we want to burn it without producing carbon dioxide. We can use hydrogen to do that. When we have excess energy at windmills in northern Germany, for example, there we could produce electricity, which at the moment is not produced because the grid cannot transport it to the consumers. We could use this electricity for electrolysis. We apply a current to water to split it into oxygen and hydrogen. The oxygen is released to the atmosphere, and the hydrogen is stored as an energy carrier. And then we can store it for however long we need to store it. And whenever we need electricity, we can burn it in a fuel cell, which will give us electricity and water, no carbon dioxide. The other problem with only focusing on electricity is electricity only makes up a third, not even, of total global energy consumption. So even if we go for 100% renewable electricity, we are still left with about 70% other energy consumption, partially highly dependent on fossil fuels at the moment. So there are mainly three other sectors of energy consumption. One is mobility, which makes up about a third of the total energy consumption. And as we can see, cars, ships, planes, they are nowadays all very reliant on petrol, diesel, kerosene, so fossil fuels. We can electrify transportation. This works, for example, for your private car. Battery electric vehicles, if you don't go too far, so the distance isn't too long and the payload is not a lot, it's only a couple of people at most. So for this, electrification works. But then if you look into trucks, into ships, and into planes, this is not a viable option because the batteries are so heavy. If you use it for trucks, which is possible, you lose quite a lot of the payload the truck can carry because it's carrying so much weight in batteries. And then for planes, if you want to go a long way, the batteries would be so heavy the plane couldn't take off. So here we also can use hydrogen. You need to put in a fuel cell, which is one standard component of a certain weight, and then you can add hydrogen tanks, the volume depending on how far you want to go. And this works because hydrogen is a very light element and the energy content, considering the weight, is very high. Then we have heating and cooling, which Gerke talked about before. We also can use fuel cells. So you can use fuel cells to generate electricity. But at the same time, you're also having a lot of waste heat, which you can very easily use to co-generate heat and electricity. So you can also heat your house with it. And then there are also boilers for hydrogen. They're similar to natural gas boilers, which can be used to just generate heat for your house. And then we're left with one more sector, which is industry. Industry uses energy in the form of feedstock for different processes. There's one industry which at the moment actually is already using a lot of hydrogen. It's the fertilizer industry. They use hydrogen, however, this is mainly produced from methane steam reforming. So you take natural gas, extract the hydrogen, and then release a whole lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is done because it's a well-known and it's a cheap process. So you get cheap hydrogen and then in turn cheap fertilizer because the feedstock doesn't cost you that much. Here, a way to decarbonize this industry would be by using so-called green hydrogen, which is produced by electrolysis using renewable electricity. But it's not done at the moment. I'm coming to that later. But then there are other industries which rely on coal, the steel industry, for example. Their coal is used to reduce the ore. It's part of the chemical treatment of the materials to, in the end, get steel. So this reduction of the ore could also be done by hydrogen. This is one of the few ways to decarbonize an industry that at the moment has a very high carbon dioxide impact. So what you can see is hydrogen can be used in all sectors, can be used for decarbonization in all sectors if the hydrogen, of course, is produced carbon neutral. The problem why this is not done so much at the moment is because it's expensive. So one thing is you need the equipment, the hardware, the electrolyzer. It's a high upfront cost. And then because of legislation, regulations of electricity price, the running cost of the electrolyzer is also quite high at the moment. And this is what we are working on at Apter. We want to radically reduce the cost for hardware, but also change the regulations so that green hydrogen becomes available and compatible to, no, sorry, what's the word?
Competitive.
Competitive, thank you. Competitive, and then can be used in all energy sectors for decarbonization and towards a clean energy future. Thank you.
Wow, please give a big round of applause for Ella. It's amazing. A hotly debated topic at the moment in the press, in the public, hydrogen and green hydrogen, in Germany as well as in Europe, you know. Yeah, thank you so much. Very insightful. I learned a lot in this talk. Who else did? Yep, hands up. All of you on YouTube, you lift your hands as well, right? We can see you. Okay, which brings us to our final speaker of this speaking round, at least. And we're very happy to have here today with us Toby Couture. Toby is the founder and director of E3 Analytics, a renewable energy consultancy based in Berlin. He has over a dozen years of experience in the energy sector and has worked with over 40 countries. 40 countries. Governments, wow. Around the world on accelerating the renewable energy deployment. Toby is a thinker, writer, and policy analyst. He has authored a wide range of reports and articles on the global energy transition. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Toby Couture.
Thank you. So it's been great to hear the different technologies, the different proposals, the different ideas, and it's great to see some of the work that's so deeply needed in Germany, both on the heating side from Thermondo as well as on the hydrogen side, which, as you rightly pointed out, is a hot topic in the news these days, and is certainly one of the German government's big pushes on the energy front. There are still a lot of skeptics on the hydrogen side. I think the future will tell. Innovation, at the end of the day, is fundamentally about what works and about what can scale. And if it can't work, obviously it doesn't get anywhere. But even if it works, that doesn't mean it can scale. We have nuclear power, for example, that a lot of people like to tout as a potential solution. Sure, nuclear works. The problem is nuclear doesn't scale. It never has, and it never will. because nuclear power is costly, slow, and faces a whole host of challenges in terms of public acceptance, in terms of waste, in terms of all of the other issues. So even though a technology works, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to scale. And I think successful innovation to tackling the Sustainable Development Goals, to tackling some of the biggest challenges that we face, is fundamentally about how do we scale. So I want to focus on two technologies that touch on, that kind of weave in between some of the topics that have been talked about. Most of my work is in developing countries. So I work a lot in Africa, I work a lot in Asia. And the examples I'm going to draw on are, in fact, more relevant to emerging countries, to emerging markets, to developing countries than they are to Europe, for example. But I also think Europe needs to, in a way, be humble about the energy transition, because Europe is about 500 million people. And there's 7.5 billion out there that have to also cook, clean, power their houses, drive or get from point A to point B. So although a lot of the innovations and the ideas that are going to power the energy transition may well be incubated in Europe, may be incubated in places like Factory here in Berlin, a lot of what it takes to scale is actually out there, is outside of Europe, is outside of North America. One of the biggest challenges that I see is in the cooking sector. People in Europe don't think about cooking much. You flick on the stove, you cook, you boil your water, or whatever. But anybody who's been to Tanzania, or has been to Kenya, or has spent time in Senegal or Nigeria, or indeed even South Africa, will know that cooking is one of the biggest challenges in people's day-to-day lives. It takes up a huge amount of time. It's responsible for over 4 million deaths per year from indoor air pollution. And frankly, it's a major contributor to deforestation and to carbon emissions. The energy mix of countries like Sierra Leone is over 90% biomass. 90% of it is driven not by transportation fuels, not by electricity, as was highlighted from some of the German statistics, but by simple biomass cooking. That's the energy pie. If you think of it in terms of a pie chart in some of these countries, that's really where the energy transition has to start. You can go 100% renewables in Sierra Leone and not even touch the real iceberg, which is largely unseen and largely, frankly, out of the eyes of most policymakers until recently. I've had the privilege to work with some NGOs and foundations funding work in this space, and we put out a few reports, including a recent report called Beyond Fire, where we look at what it would take to get scalable, financeable solutions to the problem of cooking in Africa and in parts of Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Latin America, and looking at, is it even possible to get beyond fire? Can we stop burning wood and charcoal to cook people's meals in these countries? Culture plays a big role. People still like to cook with wood and charcoal in many cultures. In fact, even in Germany, grilling is seen as a superior way to cook meat or even cook vegetables. People still use charcoal, even in developed countries. So maybe the challenge isn't completely phasing out cooking, it's rather making charcoal the thing you use every now and then, rather than the thing you use every single day for every single meal, which is the reality of day-to-day life in most of sub-Saharan Africa and indeed most of Southeast Asia, even to this day. There are an estimated 3 billion people worldwide who still use every single day biomass for cooking. That's almost half the world. So this is a huge problem, and a huge problem that needs a solution, because it's one of the major contributors of deforestation in the world, and it's contributing to major challenges, particularly in dry parts of the world, in arid regions, where people are cutting down the few remaining trees that are left just so they can cook a meal. And when you cut those trees down, desertification follows. So this is a hugely important issue. It's one that we ignore. It's one that is often ignored by policymakers, including at the very highest levels. But there's signs of change. On the heels of some of the work that foundations like the World Future Council and HEVOS in the Netherlands have been supporting, including some of the work that I mentioned in the Beyond Fire reports, people are starting to pay attention. In the last few weeks alone, I've gotten emails from the World Food Programme about the cooking work that we're doing, including from some leading UK research institutes who are focusing on actually trying to make this happen in countries like Tanzania, to turn small-scale, electric, powered with battery storage systems and solar panels to power not an electric range, because that's very inefficient, but rather electric pressure cookers that can essentially, or slow cookers, that can essentially use very little amounts of electricity and cook meals that take a longer amount of time. And in many cultures, what we're cooking is fundamentally rice, beans, or longer cooked stocks. That's the mainstay of people's diets. So if we can get a scalable, affordable solution to the problem of cooking, combining a small solar panel, a battery bank, with a high efficiency pressure cooker, you can find a solution that may not replace all of a household's cooking needs, but you can significantly replace the majority of the cooking needs. And you can make it possible to cook rice and beans and all of the other staples, including meat, that people use, or vegetables that people cook in their day-to-day lives, without cutting down the forests, without exacerbating deforestation, and without negatively impacting climate change in the process. Huge potential, largely untapped market. I encourage innovators, investors, anybody who's focusing on trying to make a difference in the world of climate to look at the cooking sector and look at what can scale there. So now I want to move to the second topic, and I want to take you to Togo. Togo is a small country in West Africa, in fact, one of the smallest countries in Africa, French-speaking. A few years ago, I had the pleasure to work with the government of Togo on their electrification strategy. We were looking at off-grid systems, mini-grids, and solar home systems, pay-as-you-go solar systems. And I was at the hotel at night, and we were having a discussion with one of the other project partners on the terrace. And all of a sudden, everything went dark, including the hotel. And then, seconds later, hotel's lights come back on. I stand up, I get to the edge of the roof terrace, I look out over the capital city of Togo, Lomé, and I see doop, 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 a few households light up. A power outage. Around 7 p.m., 6:30, 7 p.m., just as it got dark, power outage took out the power. The few lights that went on were the households that happened to be wealthy enough to have a diesel generator. The hotel has its own diesel generator in the basement, or out back. That's why the hotel's lights came back on. And I started thinking, I asked the folks in the hotel and some of the colleagues later the next day, how often does this happen? This is a few years ago, and he said, yeah, 3 or 4 times a week. 3 or 4 times a week. Germany has a power outage, maybe in certain isolated parts for a few minutes, a few times a year. And in Togo, this happens every single day, almost, of every single week, on a rolling basis. And this problem is going to get worse. What's driving these power outages? To get to my scalable solution. What's driving these power outages is not really lighting anymore. What used to drive power outages was that we had super inefficient lighting. People would flick on their lights at night and grids would collapse. Lighting is now pretty efficient. So that's not the driver. The real culprit in this murder mystery is air conditioning. In markets around the world, air conditioning is one of the aspirational purchases that households want to buy. because it's hot and the planet is getting hotter. People want air conditioning, and as soon as they can afford it, they go out and buy the cheapest air conditioning unit they can find and install it in their inefficient house, never mind that there's hardly windows, provides a bit of cooling and a respite from the heat and the humidity outdoors. Air conditioning units are massively inefficient, and they're breaking grids around the world. By breaking grids, they are essentially making the transition to a low-carbon economy much, much harder. Because if you're a power system operator, it's impossible to meet this crazy spike of electricity demand in the daytime, in that early evening time when people come home. I wrote a short piece on this a little while ago on the shark curve. And if you look at the power supply curve, power demand curve of countries like Nepal, you see a spike that's essentially in the evening hours, huge peak of electricity demand, but that's actually largely unmet because the power system can't do that in most countries. The power system can't go from 20% or 30% all the way up to 100% of demand, of peak to peak demand, just for an hour or two of the day when people flick on their air conditioning units and come home and cook and do all the rest. So how do we solve that? How do you prevent power systems from breaking because of that peak? Even in markets like California, meeting that evening peak demand is a huge challenge. So how do we do that in Togo? How do you do that in Nepal? How do you do that in Indonesia and in major cities around the world? This problem is getting worse fast as income levels rise and people buy growing numbers of air conditioning units. So I did a bit of research, try to get a sense of what are we talking about here in terms of scale. There is about 1.2 billion air conditioning units in the world today operating. That number is projected to grow to about 5 billion by 2050. According to estimates, cooling demand, to pick up on our earlier discussion on heating, cooling demand, although much smaller than thermal heating demand, is projected to grow way faster than heating demand. Heating demand grows at 1 or 2% per year globally. It's huge, but it grows slowly. Cooling, on the other hand, is projected to grow 33-fold by 2100. A huge driver of global emissions and a huge looming headache for people who run power grids, people who run power systems. How are we going to meet this 33-fold increase in air conditioning demand, making evening peaks much spikier when we have a hard time keeping the lights on in cities like Lomé today? So here's my solution, my scalable pathway to a sustainable or more sustainable cooling future. Instead of producing the cooling energy on demand when you flick on the light or flick on the switch of your air conditioning unit, why don't we start taking a page out of the storage book and producing that cooling energy during the daytime when the sun is shining. Use abundant daytime solar power to produce stored cooling energy, which can be stored in a number of different ways. You can store it in glycol, you can store it in water, you can store it in ice, you can produce any of a number of different substrates using different kinds of advanced chemistries to store cooling energy. And then, when that family comes home in Lomé, instead of flicking on their air conditioner, they just flick on their alternative cooling unit that draws on the power that's been stored, the cooling energy that's been stored during the daytime from abundant solar power. No impact on the grid or little. You need a little digital display, so it still needs a bit of electricity. But the thermal energy itself can be stored during the day when solar power is abundant, instead of causing the grid to break in the evening hours when power supply is tight. So if we can take that spike of cooling demand and shift it to the daytime, when the sun is shining and solar energy is abundant, we can significantly mitigate the impacts on the grid. We can make cooling 100% renewable, make it emissions free, and if we can get the economics right, we can make it scalable. So that the hundreds of millions of households that are going to be buying air conditioning units in the coming decades don't buy the cheapest off-the-shelf product from current providers, but rather buy a more efficient, advanced cooling solution. How do we get that to the right price point? How do we get the right product on the shelf? And how can government support by phasing out, just like we phased out incandescent light bulbs, the inefficient AC units? I think we should set a global target to phase out all sales of all inefficient air conditioning units that run on traditional flick the switch technology on demand by 2030. Phase it out, just like we did with incandescent light bulbs. They should not be available for sale in the market, and let the market drive the innovation that's needed to make those more sustainable cooling technologies available for millions. This is a huge challenge, and although awareness is starting to pick up, there's been some great research by the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado and some colleagues there on this topic. There's been some articles by Bloomberg, which colleagues like Nadim have sent along, touching on the cooling topic. Some philanthropies starting to kind of get interested in supporting this, but it is not on the radar enough. And to my mind, this is a topic we all need to be talking about. Anyone who's interested about solving the climate crisis needs to solve those two challenges, cooking and cooling. So with that, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to joining the discussions with the rest of you. Thank you.
Please give it up for Toby Couture. Thank you, Toby, so much for giving us that bigger global picture and your thoughts and points on these two major challenges, cooking and cooling, and the viable and affordable and scalable options which you outlined. Okay, with that being said, please give a big round of applause again for all of our speakers. I think that they did an amazing job touching on very different angles. I would now ask the speakers to make it a little more homey and cozy, to move together a bit closer, still distant enough, but so we can have a discussion. I take a computer also with me so we can check in then later on with the YouTube crowd. YouTube crowd, you okay out there? I guess so. All right, here we go. Okay, let me ask you a couple of questions to start off. We're talking about we're living in this 21st century and in this era of exponential developments. In terms of exponential digital technologies such as AI, blockchain, AR, VR, what do you think and believe, which one of those will make the biggest difference in the future of energy? Maybe Ella, you want to start?
Okay, I mean, I'm quite hardware focused as we produce hardware electrolyzers. So coming from that side, I think, I'm not sure if AI is the right term. Maybe it's also more big data, but definitely like collecting large amounts of data and then analyze them for predictive maintenance. I think that's one of the important things for reliability and availability of energy production, storage, and then usage. And also, it also goes together with Internet of Things, that the batteries, electrolyzers, fuel cells, solar panels, whatever, they're connected to a grid where the consumers, but also, let's say, the manufacturers or service companies have access it goes together with predictive maintenance, so that the machine knows when it's gonna break, kind of, and in advance can like notify what kind of maintenance or service is needed, which kind of spare parts are needed to shorten outages of any kind of equipment and reduce the total need for hardware, because the hardware available is more available.
Thank you. I saw a couple nods here from Gerke right next to me. Gerke, you want to add to this?
Yeah, happy to. So, in fact, I'm even a bit concerned, I would say, if we hope for too much impact from digital technologies or exponential development. I mean, there are two real clear exponential development curves, I think, in energy, which is the cost curve for solar and the cost curve for storage, and has really driven our energy transition over the past couple of decades. No one would have expected that. It will drive the transition in mobility, and that will be extremely helpful. But I think the fundamental problem is really about deploying a massive amount of physical assets. And that includes big solar parks, solar rooftops, wind parks, onshore, offshore, new cooking units, new cooling units, new heating systems. And so at least we have to really be, I think, we have to accept that digital technologies won't solve the problem for us, because it has to be a physical, we have to physically change our infrastructure. Industrial processes, hydrogen generation, as well as hydrogen usage, those are massive investments that take time. But anyways, among the digital technologies that we have available, I would also think that actually making sure that we utilize these assets then most effectively, most efficiently, that is where the biggest value lies. And I think it's a mix of big data, maybe autonomous agents. I'm sure also machine learning plays a role in that. We still need to change the physical assets, though.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with it, and I think the thought of kind of competition between, like, let's say, digital technology or physical technology, or even in the solutions that we can find, for example, in the digital technology, is maybe the wrong directions, because I think each one has a lot of potential to make a lot of impact, and only together it can be solved. So I think the big question is, how can we accelerate the speed? And I clearly think here we need to, of course, enhance innovation, but also the political part of putting like a higher price on carbon or doing more legislation, that will really speed up the process. So how can we get out the old technologies should be maybe much more in the focus than kind of competing on the new technologies.
Yeah, I would agree with the point that we fundamentally need to substitute the physicality. Physical assets need to get out of the system, and we need to transpose them with higher efficiency, cleaner, lower carbon systems. Fundamentally, with coal, there's nothing we can do to coal that's going to make coal a sustainable part of a future energy mix. It just needs to go, and we need to substitute. So at the end of the day, as much as high innovation and digital technologies and blockchain and all the other things can support on the consumer end, and I think we saw a good example with Thermondo, how to try to make the digital platform, the customer experience smoother, frictionless, more interconnected, smarter, all that's good and important. But at the end of the day, unless and until we transmit or transpose, get out the inefficient stuff, the carbon intensive stuff, and phase in lower carbon technologies, it really doesn't matter. So I would also point out that on the innovation side, although we talk a lot about blockchain and we talk a lot about, I'm more interested in the innovations that need to happen on the financing side of things to actually make things scale. Back to what I was saying a few moments ago about that technology can work, but if it doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. And the only way to really make things scale on the consumer end is to make it financeable. How the US went from sub 10% car ownership in the 1940s to 70-80% car ownership by the 1970s is largely through innovations in consumer finance. It's that people were able to borrow instead of putting all of the money into a car up front. Previously, people had horses. You could, you know, it was a totally different method of asset acquisition. I mean, you're essentially it's not like a car. And very few people, except for Germans, buy cars with cash. So we needed financial innovations to try to make consumer loans possible. We're seeing a very similar revolution happening in pay-as-you-go technologies for solar leasing in parts of Africa and parts of Asia. Small solar kits that can be sold for a few dollars a day, or even less than a few dollars a day, to households to enable them to access those technologies so that they can have clean, reliable power at home. None of that happens without the financial innovation. So you need that to be unlocked in order for it to scale. And I think, so I'm a firm believer that we need to spend a lot more time and effort thinking about how to make things financeable, especially to get to scale in the markets where it really matters. Because until it's financeable for households in sub-Saharan Africa and in rural parts of Asia, it's not going to move the dial, at least not enough to get us where we need to go on climate.
Thank you very much, guys, for these points. Really interesting. So affordability, accessibility, innovation, and consumer finance. That's a key driver, very important point here. And I think you guys spoke to this from different angles also. I think in the Thermondo area before, and you guys are working with financial institutions and business angels, etc., and then have these pledges even in the startup area. Another question I would like to ask you guys is, when energy is part of a greater systemic shift, meaning the economy as a whole or society as a whole, now from your perspective, what will take it from business, politics, and the civil sectors to accelerate this shift towards a more sustainable and healthy world? Or in other words, what is the role of these three sectors in this change process? Maybe we start with you, Philip.
Yeah, I think there are different approaches on it, but the one that we took is that we said there are large parts of the economy, of companies, and also large parts of finance that are willing to change and that are quick in changing. And therefore we believe that really with a very strong focus on these two fields, getting them involved will of course not alone solve the problem, but will give the signals to also politics to change. So I think that is one approach, but I think you can also, for example, like German Zero, I think they are called. They do an initiative that is in a way similar to us. They also want Germany to be carbon neutral as fast as possible, but they don't go through the companies. They directly go through the end consumers and try to put, in this way, pressure on politics. And I think we just need to start a lot of initiative like this, backed with the people that then carry it out, and then we will be successful. So yeah, I think there are different ways to it. And I think the interesting part is if the ball starts rolling in one direction, I think it can really speed up fast. So that is really the big hope that I have also on a global level, that we get this ball rolling. And I think especially on finance, I hope to see a strong increase of the acceleration. I mean, like a few years ago, no one would have thought that, for example, BlackRock actually like asks for these things and carries out decisions to make these things. And therefore, I think in the next years we will see a huge acceleration, and that is the big hope I have. Yeah.
I fully agree. I mean, when I look at what I see is a financial sector that is increasingly ahead of the curve on this. And in fact, it's governments by and large that are kind of dragging their feet, scared about populism, scared about negative electoral results, scared to take the big decisions. Even in Germany, at a federal level. I was speaking with a colleague just yesterday about the advancement of energy communities in Europe. There's a big discussion because of the new Renewable Energy Directive at the European level that's supposed to encourage more prosumers, more households, more individuals, more communities to be able to supply their own renewable energy. And surprisingly, although Germany has lots of energy cooperatives, has lots of energy, Genossenschaften and different kinds of community-owned energy projects, at the national level, Germany has been downright counterproductive in supporting energy community legislation at the European level. So why people are by and large way ahead of where their governments are. Financial industry, although often criticized and although they continue to finance a lot of things that shouldn't be financed, are by and large way ahead of where governments are. So I tend to think, when I look at millennials, when I look at Fridays for Future, when I look at people like Greta Thunberg to really taking the charge and really trying to push things, it's redefining what's possible. And politics, although I, as was pointed out in the outline, I work a lot with governments, I increasingly think that governments are often not as fast, aren't acting as fast, and their conception of what is possible. That's the famous German politician Bismarck, who said that politics is the art of the possible. But many politicians are limited in their ability to conceptualize what is actually possible. And I think if one thing has been brought forward to us by COVID is that the boundaries of what is politically possible have fundamentally changed. People are ready for very dramatic and ambitious action on climate and on these major global challenges. And I think politicians underestimate, again, the boundaries of what is possible. So I really hope we have a much more engaged, much more active, much more vociferous conversation in the years ahead that really says, listen, the boundaries have been redefined. We need to really get serious on this. So I hope that politics can go from a laggard to a leader on this. But it's going to be pushed from, at least from my sense, from below and from the financial industry, not led by government. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I would like to continue with the government aspect, like what governments do or don't decide on. I think it also has to do with lobbying. And while lobbying is necessary, if it's alone for the fact that politicians are politicians, they're not specialists on all the different areas they need to make legislation on. So therefore, lobbying is necessary. But then, how do you make sure that, let me call it, the right voices are heard? So that's, it has to do with access to politicians. It has to do with funding. I think this is also why it's so maybe difficult for lobbying for new technologies, because the existing technologies already have money. They have the money they can put into lobbying, and new technologies, emerging technologies, don't necessarily have that money yet, and therefore cannot fund as much lobbying. So that's one point. And then another thing is on the company, on the industry side, there are some very good solutions for different problems, but then the problem is it was designed to solve this problem, but not for consumers to use it. So it meets the problem, but it does not meet the consumer needs, and then that's a problem with scaling. If it's not accepted by the consumers, then there's no point in manufacturing it, because nobody will use it. And so while I think this should be self-evident for companies so that they make something that then also can be sold, it's still an issue sometimes that you have a solution that does not scale because of lacking acceptance.
Yeah. First of all, I fully agree to what you said, and because I think it is, we will have a very, very hard time in going on that energy transition, at least fast enough, if we don't get governments to change, because the incentives are quite strong, right? I mean, all over the world we have still tons of fossil fuel subsidies, but even if you look at Germany, for instance, right, green power is 3 to 4x as expensive as natural gas or oil at the moment for a regular household consumer. And at the moment, no technology and no business model is going to change that. That has to be regulatory shift. And I mean, I have the highest respects for anyone who has to make these policy decisions because they're complex, right? And there are many people talking to you, and because there are so many physical assets involved, I mean, all of these assets are also connected to vested interests, right? And decisions you take have a big impact, and but I think we won't manage without a stronger or a clear regulatory framework that supports the energy transition. And I mean, in a very abstract level, it's two things. I think it is proper carbon prices on everything, and secondly, I think it's making sure that things work. So I think government has a role to play in, first of all, of course, supporting research development, but then also in that first kickoff phase to make things work. And I think in Germany we have our success stories, right, with solar and wind. Maybe with renewable heating technologies, that's going to be the next success story, because once that is in place, I mean, what I've really experienced these last 5 to 6 months is all of a sudden the entire dynamics change. And then financing also is really important to make that play out. So for instance, if a customer comes to us, we can show him, okay, these are going to be your monthly costs. That's not just a calculation, because we offer you the financing solution. We can either offer you to get an inefficient boiler, but that's going to be more expensive for you, or you take the efficient one and it's going to be cheaper. Why? Well, the efficient one is way more expensive up front, but the customer doesn't even see that, right? Because he only pays a monthly fee. But it's compensated by his lower energy costs. And that's then the role of business, I think. But we still need a good regulatory framework.
So how high would the price have to be, the carbon price in this case? You know, you say government leadership, we need higher prices to bridge the gap, but you said natural gas and oil are significantly cheaper than the renewable options. Now, renewable heat means either solar thermal or geothermal. Geothermal being powered where the pump is powered by electricity, which you can buy renewably. But how have you guys done modeling? Like, how high would the carbon price have to be to bridge that gap? Is that a politically realistic, politically acceptable, or politically, I don't know, to price? I guess that's it's where I wonder with carbon pricing. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I think it is the right path to go there step by step, right? Also from a political standpoint, kind of what the German government is planning now, and I think it can make a difference once we get to something like 40 euros a ton. But it would additionally, especially for our case, be extremely helpful to also make power cheaper, right? Because the switch from fossil fuel to heat pump is very, very much dependent on that 3 to 4x spread between power and gas or oil costs that I mentioned before. And that has to get closer to each other. So if we were able to get to a factor below 3, all of a sudden the economics work a lot better, which is, by the way, in that case, normal across the world. That is a very, very peculiar German situation, that our power is, even our renewable power is so expensive, and our natural gas and oil is so much cheaper for households.
Thank you, guys. Now, is there a question in the local audience here? If so, then I'd like to ask you, maybe come up and use this microphone here and ask the speaker around.
Hi. I actually have a question for Toby. You mentioned earlier that there's storage solutions for cooling. I was just curious if you can expand on what these solutions look like. Thanks.
So in the 19th century, the second largest export of the United States after cotton was ice. What the heck were we doing with so much ice in the 19th century? People would harvest it in the winters from lakes and would bring it to Boston, to New York, and export it to countries around the world, as well as to hotels and other clients on the eastern seaboard and the wealthier parts of the country. It would get shipped to countries like Australia, to India. In the 1840s or 1850s, there was a big boom in India, a big excitement around ice. And they had storage facilities, and you cover it in sawdust, and the ice would be sold to different clients. Chop the block, bring it in, provide cooling. You'd pay by weight. So we kind of forget that that worked. That was the origin of air conditioning, basically. It's just ice. Now, today we don't have to go to chop into glaciers or frozen lakes in Siberia during the wintertime to get ice. We can produce it. So to my mind, whether the fundamental cooling technology is glycol, which we use all the time in thermal exchange units, is water that's frozen, or is some other advanced chemical storage or chemical means of storing cooling energy, I leave that to the market. I think the point is what works and what is scalable. And to my mind, ice works just fine. If it worked in the 19th century, the big problem with ice then was the transporting of it. The harvesting of it was dangerous. It took a lot of time. You had to ship it and slide it across the landscape and get it onto boats and all the rest. And then you had the losses along the way. We talk about power system losses. And this is the ice is dripping as you're transporting it, so huge losses. But now we don't have to do that because you can produce it on site. So sites like factory, warehouses, businesses, households, multi-unit residential buildings, which I'm sure is on your radar in terms of things you want to tackle for the heating end, they could all be producing ice on site and then just distributing it through HVAC systems. So sometimes the best solutions are the ones that are right in front of us. So that's how I would answer that question. There may be better, more efficient, higher density ways of solving the cooling problem, but I think until those come, we can use what we have.
Which is amazing, like Back to the Future. No, it's true, right? So some of the solutions are the most simplest ones, or like thinking what we already had and how we could take a different spin on it and do it. We have a question here from Jakar, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing the name wrong, and it goes to the entire panel. It said, do we need financing innovation or just a larger adoption of what already is out there? I think you kind of hit on this already, but maybe you want to elaborate on this a little bit. So do we need the financing innovation, or do we need just a larger adoption of what is already out there? And I think the two go hand in hand.
Let me pick up Toby's definition of innovation before. So innovation, I think, is what works and what scales, is what you said, right? And obviously we do have financing solutions that work, at least in our case, but make them scale is still difficult. It's not that easy to find financing for your SPV with which you want to finance the next X thousand renewable heating systems. Is that already innovation? All I know is we definitely need smart people to work on our financing and to tap the capital.
I actually think the good thing about finance, how it is right now, it puts risk into the calculation. And what happens now for pensions funds, but also other big money, they put the risk on the one hand side to the nature and to all the costs that are associated to what will happen when we have natural crisis all the time in the future. And then there's the risk to politics, and then there's the risk to consumers who don't want to buy products anymore that are bad for the climate. So already right now they take all the assets out of this bad technology, and therefore I think yes, this is working. We are seeing right now a trend that works, and hopefully that accelerates. So I would not try to change the whole system. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say we have a lot of, I mean, look at the boom in recent years of climate bonds. I mean, bonds are one of the oldest financial instruments we have, and yet they're still working just fine. Pay a steady coupon, low risk, people can buy them and invest long term and trust in the steady, predictable payment stream provided by the bond purchase. Climate bonds are a huge part of the solution, and there's nothing particularly innovative about them. So I think the question is spot on. There's a lot of the tools we have, it comes down to how we deploy them. And if the tools we have are working, they're just not scaling enough, what we need to do is turn climate bonds into not only a 400 billion or 500 billion dollar asset class, but rather a $50 trillion asset class. Climate bonds ultimately long-term need to dominate the bond market. Instead of just being a kind of alternative investment on the side. Everything needs to ultimately become a green bond. Sovereign governments shouldn't be, why should we be investing in carbon intensive infrastructure with public money in the 21st century?
Doesn't make sense, absolutely. Ella.
Yeah, I feel like I don't necessarily know enough about finance to really answer that question. But one side is what was mentioned before, like only things that get financed are realized. So I think one shift that is needed is on the consumer side is like where private people have their bank account, for example. Like, what does the bank do with that money? Some banks are really clear about that. For others, it's like really hard to find out, and most people probably do not really think about it. But then if you like go to your, let's call them green banks, who only invest their money in renewable energy or like only borrow money to renewable energy or eco-friendly companies, that's like taking money out of the fossil fuel market, and then if that market does not have money anymore, it will shrink by itself just because of lack of finance. And then another thing is what like Gerke touched upon earlier is making technology accessible by not selling the hardware, but like having it as a service, so like heating as a service or cooling or like leasing the equipment, which gets rid of the high upfront costs and makes it more accessible and used. Yeah.
Thank you. We're right at the 90-minute mark. I think we have time for one more question. Is there one more question from the on-site audience? No? No one? Okay. Let's check in with our YouTube crowd. Yes, there is. I cannot pronounce that. Forgive me. Question is, should governments support the change by punishing emissions with higher taxes or other instruments? Governments, I think we start with Toby here.
So, for several years we had debate that was largely driven by economists around whether we should have emission trading schemes or carbon taxes. And jurisdictions like British Columbia in Canada opted for a carbon tax and have had some degree of success proving the functionality of that, essentially a kind of carbon tax that gives people back a dividend if they consume less carbon in a given year, so you get it back through your tax return. And then you had the European Union and others in New England who opted for more of a carbon trading for large industry. But there's another way to try to get the pricing in the back door that I'm quite fond of, and I alluded to it briefly in some of what I said, but it's using the regulatory instruments. We don't need to govern everything with the price instrument. The price instrument is great at making, in terms of allocative efficiency, but it's not always the best way to drive things out of the market or drive things into the market. You can use other tools. And we talked about regulation and policy and things like, you know, we can talk about feed-in tariffs, but from a regulatory standpoint, one of the most powerful, one of the single biggest carbon reduction efforts ever was led by the government of Ontario in Canada. And that was simply government decision to say, we're going to phase out all of our coal plants. And they did that in a decade. From 2004 to 2014, every single coal plant in Ontario got phased out, about 10,000 megawatts of capacity off the grid. It wasn't necessarily because the coal wasn't economic, wasn't doing great, but it was actually functioning. It was just a government decision to say, we're done with that. It's causing too many deaths, it's causing too many health problems, and we're going to phase it out. And the same thing with incandescent light bulbs. It's not that they don't work, they're cheap. People like the incandescent light bulbs. There was even hoarding of incandescent light bulbs. People were going to buy, you know, bagfuls of them because they like the light better than LEDs. And I just think, God, but this happens. So phasing things out can actually work and can have tremendously large real-world impacts on emissions. So I think, as much as I like the debate that economists have, you know, foisted in a way into the public sphere around carbon pricing instruments, I think carbon pricing is an important tool, but we shouldn't outsource the climate battle to a pricing instrument. Governments have other tools, and I think when it comes to things like incandescent light bulbs and inefficient air conditioning units, we need to start phasing out.
Wow. So regulation versus market. Absolutely. Great point. Ella.
Give me a moment. Yeah, I like this approach. I mean, there is this, I'm not really sure if it's a saying, but like, der Markt regelt das, the market will take care of it, which, like, people who don't like regulations and laws too much will say that, like, if there's enough consumers interested in it, it will happen. I think for some things it can work, for others incentives from the government can definitely work. Also for like accessibility. I mean, there are people like my parents, they are thinking about getting solar panels for their house, but then it's a thing of, is it worthwhile? Like, what about the investment? And then if people are interested, but because of the market situation, it's actually too expensive, then this thing of the market will take care of it actually does not work. And then it's very helpful to have supporting legislation.
Yeah, there's a German saying, and I'm not sure if I translate it correctly, but to put on an additional belt while you're already wearing suspenders. Gürtel zum Hosenträger. Not sure. Is that the right? Is there a good translation? I don't know. But the challenge is so important, and we don't have that much time left, right? So I think it really makes sense to take both angles. I think it solves kind of a lot of underlying problems if we put a price on carbon, and then we also have to make sure, of course, that we put a price on all carbon, right? Because in my example, for instance, well, we already have a pricing or an emissions trading system that does not apply to natural gas and oil consumption for households. So then we're going to change that now in Germany, but because with a carbon price you get into all of these complexities, right? And I mean, obviously we could have this whole session just on different types of emissions trading systems, etc. The most important point is that there's a price and that it's high enough on a lot of carbon, and I think that would be really helpful. But I think it's definitely helpful to additionally put on the belt, and that might mean phase out of coal. I think also the special incentives that we have now on renewable heating systems make a lot of sense, and the Kaufprämie or the bonus you get for a new e-vehicle. I think those are all measures to make it work in the first place, to kind of scale to the first into a first market penetration that is then high enough to run by itself. And for that, I think we need additional measures, and then also to phase out old assets. Yeah.
Yeah, just a small addition, because I agree to 100%. I just want to strengthen that the carbon price is not high enough. It's super, super low, and therefore we need to get it up as fast as possible. Yeah, that should be the goal.
Okay. Thank you very much for your contributions. I think we heard some amazing talks. I learned a lot personally. I think the audience here in the room as well, as much as the people who have been watching us on YouTube. Please give another big round of applause for our amazing speakers tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us here in the Factory Görlitzer Park. Thank you for following us on YouTube and watching us on YouTube. And have a great evening. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Oh, we have one final announcement to make. I hope we're still live. We're still live. Okay, this is live, right? So we have a final announcement to make to remind you guys that maybe we can get the slide back, and Nadim is back on stage as well. We have a final slide for the Global Goals Jam that you can now sign up. Roman, do we have the slide still? The final?
While he's setting up the slide.
Here we go.
Yeah, just let me, last one. Yeah, so just also to voice, I mean, this for me has been just a case study type of conversation around how the whole 2030 agenda is set up, right? So goal number 7 around clean and affordable energy, we saw something around energy efficiency, we saw something about clean cooking, renewables, more affordable ways to create energy, but also research and development into new ways of decarbonization, deep decarbonization. And then we went into financing, regulatory affairs, so SDG 17, and SDG 16. And for me, this is just an opportunity to just showcase how a lot of these discussions, although there's a lot to say about the 2030 agenda and how easily it can be used for rainbow washing and people just saying how we contribute to SDG X and Y and that's it. It's much more intricate. And actually there are 17 goals, 169 targets and indicators to basically allow us to track this type of conversation and go much deeper into it. And today I heard things like, yeah, how might we move to better solutions and more innovative solutions in terms of cooling? How might we look at new innovative financial instruments to help this transition? And a lot of these sort of how might we questions are the types of challenges that we sort of tackle in a 2.5-day event. We don't claim that we will solve them and to a terminal stage. But of course, we look at them. So if both you have similar challenges for us that you want to solve and you want to partner with the Jam, please reach out. And if you want to participate and solve similar challenges, so this is something organized by 2030 Cabinet, my firm, Plant Values and Unternehmensgrün in Berlin, but also in 7 other cities in Germany. So globalgoalsberlin.com to register for Germany and globalgoalsjam.de for Germany-wide. Thank you very much to the 4 of you, and I already look forward to the rest of the theme week and the series of the other upcoming themes with the Sustainability Circle.
Thanks again, Nadim, for this summary from a SDG point of view. And yes, guys, please go and sign up if you're interested, or those of you who are here, Nadim is there, you can talk with him directly. Again, thanks to our panelists and speakers today. Another final big round of applause. Come on, we finally have the chance to give applauses. We're not behind screens anymore. We hear applause. Thank you. And good evening there also on YouTube. Thank you. Bye-bye.